When a trap is introduced, it's shown to you in a way where you immediately know its entire path and what it does and so on. The game loves to tell you in straightforward ways how it works or what's happening and let you deal with it how you want. This is, fine, and I guess it's a masterpiece that I've loved my whole life. It's very fair on the player.
Sliding spiked death pucks coming out from around the corner you can't see is just bad fucking design. It's bad design in any game. It's no different in Zelda. You don't get a get out of jail free card. You gotta roll 3 times. In the first Zelda, you see that shit. In Link to the Past, you see that shit. In Ocarina, oops! Yeah, I know. That's the nature of 3D, but if it doesn't work in 3D, you change it.
It's the same room. The same room? What were the odds? How the fuck? Having done a lot of research in YouTube analytics and search engine optimization, looking for ways to bring in more traffic to my channel, I have discovered the most effective way to get more subscribers. Tell people things they already believe. Here's why Ocarina of Time is the greatest game ever made. Alright, it's not really the greatest game ever, but it's like here's why it's the greatest Zelda game ever made. Okay, it's only like the 4th best Zelda, but the point is people are being too hard on this. Look at this. Look! This is an overcorrection. Let's go back to those 2 videos. Someone has to be wrong here, right? Fortunately, this isn't actually an opinion. There is a right answer here. They're both wrong. Aaron's wrong about the obstacle itself. It's a very simple path, and even if the spiky hockey puck is out of view, it's not exactly hard to time when it'll be back. But Harris is wrong about it being true of the game as a whole. I mean, let's recall, what's literally the first thing that happens when you walk into the ice cavern? What separates Zelda traps from FromSoft traps isn't fairness, it's that in Dark Souls one of those icicles would have taken off half of your health instead of like a fraction of it. Which brings us to the real complaint that these 2 elaborate videos are dancing around making outright. The game's too easy. And the easiness of post-Ocarina Zeldas is a legitimate problem for experienced players. It's not just a matter of preference. People always ask why they can't add an easy mode to Dark Souls, and people always say, oh, it has something to do with like the daunting tone or not babying the player like mainstream games or something, but there's a much more important reason. Action RPGs are an inherently broken genre. The action part and the RPG part are inherently at risk of obviating the other. If you can just grind until the fight is trivial, the action mechanics become trivial. If you can just learn the patterns, then the RPG mechanics of leveling up and upgrading become superfluous. Every mechanic in Souls hinges on the game being hard, bordering on unfair. If the combat was straightforwardly fair, you could, and many would, beat every boss without paying any attention to upgrades or armor or magic or items. You would blow through the bosses without exploring. And don't tell me it's technically doable because like 20 weirdos on Twitch can beat the game without leveling with a Guitar Hero guitar. I'm talking about normal people here. For us mortals, every dodge roll is just a roll of the dice with increasingly better odds. And that would certainly be a damning criticism of Ocarina if it was primarily an action RPG. It's not. It's an exploration and puzzle game with some action set pieces. I mean, how many times are you really squaring up against an enemy and just using your sword and shield? The lizards in Dodongo Cavern? Some skeletons here and there? Dark Link? The Iron Knuckle? And Ganon. Everything else is figuring out the vulnerabilities and patterns of enemies, solving environmental puzzles, and then combining the 2. I mean, they've tried to juice up the combat, but to no real avail. It's just not a priority. So let's judge Ocarina on what it was trying to do. Fantasy adventures all have pretty similar starts. The protagonist starts in a prelapsarian utopia and has to leave it behind in order to save it. The idea is you'll care about this fictional world and the possibility of it ending if you get a sense that it's worth saving beforehand. But movies actually have a really hard time selling it. I mean, look at Lord of the Rings. What do you have to save? You have this guy, this house, this weirdly conventional dining room. Would you cry for the loss of this Shire Williams-Sonoma country kitchen fine dining set? But video games, they can have a much easier time of it. Zelda's slow as molasses tutorials serve a purpose other than teaching you the mechanics. They get you familiar with your community. The way no one seems to be worried about money, everyone knows each other. the music. It's just nice. When you start your adventure, you know what's at stake is a society worth defending. And when it takes that away from you, you really feel it. Alright, most of you know now what happens halfway through the game. But there's a prelude to it that often goes unremarked upon. So imagine you're a kid and you first get to Kakariko Village. The game kind of pushes you to check out the graveyard. And when you enter the graveyard, you immediately see gravestones you can move. So you move it and you find a secret passage. And you go down and there's just one or a few monsters. So you square up to it, and before you can do anything, you're helpless, without warning. And if you don't think to just mash buttons and instead just wait for the animation to end, you get squeezed to death. You just die, one and done. So you've learned a lesson here. Fuck these guys. So flash forward, you've become an adult, time to see how the happy town you've grown to see is a safe place, and there are 5 of them. Right next to you. Welcome to adulthood. And playing through this game again, I became really impressed with how many moments like this they carefully designed into the game. In the first section of the game, there are places you sort of glom onto because you know they're safe. They almost exist outside of the dangerous real world. I mean, time literally doesn't pass when you're there. The music is upbeat. A lot of the non-dungeon action happens here. Of the 5, 2 are filled with monsters and 2 have been violently depopulated. Lots of games have had twists before, but I've never seen it done so effectively with just changes in the environment and gameplay. And the tone, I mean, Dark Souls did a lot to improve on Zelda's combat, but Ocarina pioneered its tone. This kind of twist is also something a video game can really effectively do in a way other media can't. We talk about the differences between games and movies, and we almost exclusively look at the basic things like choice and player agency. But there are subtle differences too, like how people experience the narrative on its own in a game. In a video game, time acts differently. It almost feels like it dilates. You can go hours without getting bored, and this means you can develop characters, cultivate relationships, and explore complicated ideas to an extent that would require an entire movie in just the first act. I'll give you an example. Let's say your player character is a boy. You meet a girl, you're brought together by a common goal, you get close. There's a villain, you catch up with him, he tests your bond but you resist, and you defeat the villain and fall in love and you live happily ever... Except it's not the end, it's the end of the first half. It's a cliche to talk about how affecting this scene is, like, haha, look at the dumb nerds cry at the little pixels, but it shouldn't be surprising. We have all been trained over a lifetime of consuming media that if a story begins one way, it'll end this way. With video games, a singular event can pack the power of a final act climax and also act as an inciting incident. What's now called the 5th generation of consoles is seen as almost a lost generation. Lying between the fully realized pixel art masterpieces of the SNES and Genesis and the fully realized multimedia spectacles of the Xbox and PS2, the 5th generation is just a graveyard of half-baked ideas, failed experiments, franchises that couldn't make the jump to 3D, and hideous hardware kludges. A punchline almost. But few games I can think of that came after ever took advantage of the extra time a video game has to build story beats like that. The ability of games to present non-linear, non-3-act structure stories without sacrificing populist accessibility has gone completely unexplored. And not long after, games started importing talent from Hollywood, who streamlined them according to a movie script formula, and more emphasis was placed on getting the player into the action as fast as possible to keep them hooked. But Ocarina of Time aged, right? That's what we're told. But let's be clear. Ocarina didn't age because of bad design choices that we were willing to overlook because it was our first 3D adventure. My first 3D adventure was Rascal on PS1. Yeah, I have no problem admitting there were bad design choices. Ocarina aged because it was primarily a puzzle game and narrative experience, and you only get to really play those once. Every time after, you just go through the motions. It's why I've always taken complaints about the game being too easy or too linear with a grain of salt. because the people who say that are almost always reflecting on their latest playthrough of a game they've played multiple times. But really, it's quite easy if you've never had the experience of playing a 3D Zelda to get stuck, to get lost, to decide to check out all those mysterious places on your map. I mean, the fairy is easy enough to ignore. Ocarina of Time revisionism, like I said, is an overcorrection, but specifically an overcorrection of a bigger trend. From about the early 2000s to the early 2010s, gamers and game critics put way too much emphasis on the movie-ish qualities of a game. People were excited for A-list voice actors even when those actors were clearly phoning it in.
All those people. You're still my son, and I love you, but I can't begin to tell you how disappointed in you I am.
People were excited for fancy, pre-rendered cutscenes, no matter how poorly written.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
And graphics ruled the day. But the well-deserved backlash to this trend didn't just stop at bashing this tunnel vision. It essentially started shunning narratological aspects at all. This is dumb. I mean, imagine if film criticism became obsessed over the issue of whether or not films were different enough from plays. Hey bro, only casuals like watching 12 Angry Men. It doesn't have a single tracking shot or dolly zoom. Not to mention in many ways the cinematic aspects and the gameplay are inextricably linked. Not just in motivating the player, but built into the mechanics. I mean, how do you know if a creature is hostile? How do you know if it's vulnerable to a crit? How do you know where it's vulnerable? How do you know if a place is safe or dangerous? Those are all communicated through animation, sound design, mise-en-scène, and voice acting. The techniques of filmmaking. The other reason it's stupid is you now have this delusional attempt by critics to create a structure of objective criticism by being cartoonishly reductionist. You have deep dive analyses into video games based mostly around whether you can change field of view. We have hours per dollar measures on game store pages now. You know, there's a popular YouTube channel that analyzes Zelda dungeons solely by reducing them down to their topology and then counting how many dead ends there are. Because the more dead ends, the more complicated the dungeon is, and therefore the better it is. That's the stupidest goddamn thing I've ever heard. And it's insanely popular. Honest criticism starts with how a game makes you feel, and works backwards from there to figure out why. But people are afraid to do that because it's subjective. You can't be right. And everything's a goddamn debate club on the internet now. So now you have people trying to create quantitative measures of good gameplay, and most are based on replayability, which inherently privileges twitch action over every other type of game mechanic, which, I mean, if you prefer twitch action, that's fine. That's still a preference, though. It's not a mathematical fucking proof that your taste is better, and that means that a puzzle game is now being judged a failure for not having Ninja Gaiden Black level swordplay. And everything else the game did well is just dismissed as bells and whistles. Why? Is that the only thing people come to games for? Really? If I asked you to list your top 5 favorite games, is that the thing that would first come to mind? Am I crazy? Am I
Am I so out of touch? No, it's the children who are wrong.